Hello. Well, today,
Hey,
yeah, we've got a guest contributor, Michael, um, who lives in the United States. Whereas Steve and myself, we reside in Brazil. We have somebody from another part of the world to give some fresh opinions. So, well, it's over to Steve.
So, Mike, I'm going to grill you a little bit here, but it's it's all good. I can promise you that. You are American, of course, right? So,
yes, I am, and
yeah,
thanks to you guys for inviting me on.
thank you for being here. So, I'd like to know a little bit about uh, how life has changed in the United States over over the course of your life, right? You and I know we're about the same age, right? And so, I'd like, as you've always remained in the same country. I'd like to know, and your country, it seems to evolve really quickly. Things that happen in your country evolve really quickly. So I'd like to know how times have changed, if it's for the better, if it's for the worse, So t tell me a little bit about your perception of growing up, first of all, and then we'll take it from there. In a general,
Sure,
in a general term, not a personal term, but generally, of what was happening around you and what you perceived.
sure. Well, Steve, as I mentioned to you, I've always lived in the U.S., although I have lived in different states. And for work, I did a lot of consulting and like operations and supply chain. So I've also traveled to many different states in the U.S., as well as some other parts of the world, but those were always for business trips. I mean, to your question, from when I was a kid to now, I mean, I know it's a cliche, but I feel like even the U.S. has lost a lot of innocence. We've stood for a lot of things, and over time, not done some great things. And those things have come out slowly over time. And I think people have a very different view today. Um, and that view, I think, is accelerated. The change has accelerated a lot in the last 8 years. So um, I would say that today we're navigating some huge political shifts. There's a lot of uncertainty. When I was growing up, I don't remember those things quite the same. Now, obviously, very early, there was the Bay of Pigs. There was a variety of things that happened, but we had a lot of stability in the world. And, we're not at that point right now. There's a lot of turbulence right now.
Well, you said that you had a lot of stability when you were younger. I mean, of course, you were looking at the world through a younger person's eyes, of course, you know. But looking back, how, why would you say that was, that it was more stable?
I think part of it was you got to go back in time and realize that, and it's there's some ways it was similar to the UK where you have the BBC. We only had a couple of channels when I grew up, right? So the media, there was really only a few sources,
Channels on the
and
TV, you say?
on the TV, right?
Yeah, sure,
And
sure.
for the most part, uh, the press sort of self censored themselves, and I think there was a lot of things that were not shared. So I think there was a pretty rosy picture for people. Now that didn't mean, if you're study the history of the U.S., we've had college riots, we've had the Vietnam protests. So there's been plenty of history of that, but generally speaking, from my perspective, it's gotten more turbulent, and part of it's just as people have learned more, and generally with that proliferation of things like podcasts, different information's got out, and you know, where we were more monolithic and more homogenized, it's more diverse and it's more polarized today.
Do you, when you were growing up, how was the economy, for example? I mean, was it a case of dad went to work and mum stayed at home? When we look at the US and we look back at like sort of like the late 60s, early 70s, we looking at the US, we have this image of the bloke going to work, and the kid, the wife staying at home cooking his apple pie and putting it on the windowsill to cool off, and the two kids are coming home from school and things like, and the white picket fence and all this. Was it really like that, or were there pockets of affluence, or even pockets of poverty, if you like?
Yeah, so I mean, I can give you my perspective, which is I grew up in I would say mostly middle class upbringing. Yeah, my dad was the one who went to work, but my mom stayed home, even though she was well educated and she later on in life worked. But I also am the grandchild of immigrants that came from Italy. And my grandparents, who lived not far from where I grew up, they both worked. So she started working, I think, after ninth grade. He started working after eighth grade. So I think there was that generation. My grandfather came over on the boat. He worked in steel mills and she worked in sewing factories. They worked much harder and they had a lot less, and they went through the Depression. So I think that my parents had a sense of they were doing better than their parents because they were, and were able to afford a more affluent lifestyle. So they went from sort of lower income blue collar families to middle class, more affluent type living. So yeah, we got to that where it was kind of the dad worked and mom was home, but it did always one generation back before that, and it was a much tougher life.
And was that like a general consensus, or were there? I mean, you said how your family grew up, but what about all the families around you? Were they more or less on the same patamar, or were there the majority was on the same patamar, or a minority was on the same patamar? And when you talk about the majority and minority, were the majority where did you live when you were younger, by the way?
So I grew up in the state of Pennsylvania, and I lived outside Philadelphia, and it was in a suburb that was affluent and mostly white. But my grandparents lived in like the steel towns up in Bethlehem, where it was again much grittier. So it was a combination. I can't really speak for others. I would say that as I got older and I talked to people, I've met people from hugely different backgrounds. Some that didn't advance, they didn't advance so much more from their grandparents and their parents, and others that was very lucky. I got to go to Yale College, and I got to meet a lot of really, really privileged people whose families had money for a long time, who'd done private schooling. And so that was kind of an eye opener to me. So I can't speak for, especially when I was younger, because I really only knew what was around me. But as I got older, I started to see much more inequality and, much different contexts than mine growing up.
And of course, you were looking at the world through older eyes, I imagine, as a young adult.
Yeah, I mean,
which also opens your eyes more.
Yeah, I mean, so as it mirrors my comment about the U.S. maybe becoming less innocent, right? I mean, as a person, as a kid, right, I was more innocent. As I grew older, become a little more cynical might be a rough word, but you understand inequality and things that are unfair that happen, and so yeah, you get a different sense as you get older and you mature.
Yeah, and you said that you said that your mother started to work a little bit later on. Principally, it was your dad that went to work. Did she begin to go to work because she had time on her hands because the kids grown up, or was it the necessity of the economic situation in the US at that time, or was it just that she felt like she had this calling to to sort of get on the bike, if you know what I mean?
I think I don't know what the divorce rate is in like Brazil, but divorce is pretty high in the U.S. and my parents divorced. And that's what really caused her to go back to work. So it was out of necessity, but it wasn't because the conditions had changed in terms of like the economy. It was more that the personal family conditions had changed.
Get you.
And by the way, as you know, I mean, divorce is really common. And if you go way back, as you mentioned, women stayed at home, and now they're a huge part of the workforce in a way that was a huge boon to the economy, but it also made tons of changes in the whole fabric of the society.
I know. I'm separated myself, so I know what it's about.
Mm-hmm.
So you're growing up and you move from state to state in your work. Were there a great difference of what was around you? Did your when you moved change from state to state? Did the ambience around you did it change all that much? Our state's very different one from the other. I mean, we get these ideas of in Texas everybody wears a Stetson, right? So, I mean, did you have to wear a Stetson?
So it's funny you asked that question, because although we did not move, I did not personally move around a lot. My father did, actually, because his father was in the Navy and he moved around a lot. I only lived in a couple of states, but when I started working, I moved around. And one of my first consulting projects was in Texas, and and it was down doing some work near El Paso and Juarez in Mexico. And here I am, a 22-year-old, and the first thing I needed to do was make sure I went and bought some good, calfskin leather, boots, because I had to have them. And I remember being in the store and making a comment to a colleague. Can you imagine that guys wear business suits and wear boots? And this guy heard me and he said, "You must be new to Texas."
Yeah. Lovely. So and were there many Stetsons floating around?
Oh yeah. So you had just clothes, culture. I mean, it is true. The U.S. is very diverse depending on the geography, and I enjoyed doing a lot of work down in the South. I found a lot of really good, honest people, and just a little different way of interacting. But yeah, it's different. It's different in the Midwest versus different on the coasts versus different in Texas.
Yeah. And so where are you situated now?
So right now I'm talking to you from Nashville, Tennessee.
Nashville.
And this is a melting pot town also that's known for its music. Yeah. And there's a couple places in the U.S. that are known for music, and this is one of them.
Yeah, for the country western.
Yep.
Yeah, Nashville, Tennessee. So are you still wearing your boots?
I don't.
Hang on. Oh.
I traded my boots for sneakers a little bit.
But we have to because it hurts our feet now as we're older.
It's easier on the joints, and you can't run in boots.
Yeah. So
although I will say one thing, Mark, and you might end up believing this, but we have someone on our Facebook page who I know, who famously, once I was doing some work in Western Canada, showed me how to run, that she could run in the snow in high heels. So anything is possible.
Oh yeah, I think I know who. Yes. Yeah.
You think I know? Okay.
Yeah, I could guess. Yeah. I'll fill Steve in later. Yeah. I'll jump in here. I mean, obviously, I visited the US in holiday in '94 when the World Cup was going on. It did strike me how little interest there was actually in the World Cup. It happens in Europe. It doesn't matter what game's being played. This was in 1994. And they'd have it in the pub or a bar, and there'd be like one person watching or two, either an Italian guy or somebody, Latin or Italian, or a black guy. They're the only people that were watching it. Everybody else was in the other bar, watching whatever else was on TV or doing other things. That's one thing I remembered. I wasn't there for the World Cup. It just so happened I booked a holiday to go there. 2 weeks traveling. Was it called a Western Adventure or something? It was a tour. Yeah. Not the best way to see the US. Stop off at all the all the normal touristy places, encouraged to spend money. Yeah. How you guys survive with local taxes, I do not know. I'm still confused when I look at them today. Yeah. Um, that's quite incredible. Uh, didn't feel really unsafe. I mean, you hear things. I mean, walked around San Diego a little bit at night. Didn't, no, didn't see any problems there. I didn't like LA much. Sorry if anyone that happens to live in Los Angeles. But to me, when we're talking about artificial false towns, we're talking about different places. The impression I got is how fake LA actually is. Yeah. And one of the places a tourist guide pointed out was where the Rodney King riots happened. Hang on, this is a tourist attraction now. You know, you got
Mhm.
the shopping centre and the shopping mall and all that. That's where Rodney, yeah, that's where the video was shot and everything. Oh, this is a yeah. They got a plaque there yet? Yeah, and obviously it was just after the quake as well, so there's still some building work. Yeah, so I visited there, and I've done San Francisco. Um,
Have you done any parts in the middle of the country or any smaller places?
no, I've only been
It
there once. Yeah.
it's a very different. The U.S. is very different in its big
Mm.
cities versus its mid-sized cities versus its rural
Yeah,
areas.
yeah. I mean, obviously, as Steve was saying, and I watch films more than Steve, and a lot of my perception about the US is through TV and film. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, I grew up watching the teen comedies of the 80s, Breakfast Club and things like that.
Mhm.
Yeah, and obviously, yeah, other things that came out. Starsky and Hutch, I know is artificial. Dukes of Hazzard, well,
I was going to say I was going to throw in Dukes of Hazzard. That was so artificial.
oh yeah, we knew that. I mean, they've all but tried to stop it being shown now for a couple of reasons that yeah, can't really see
It,
it. We
it
didn't.
was it was terrible stereotyping, but it was still an interesting show.
It was fun, and I think that was it. It was fun. Yeah, we knew it wasn't the real. Even when we were growing up, it's 7, 8, 9, 10. You know, it's not the real US. Yeah. And more recently, I mean, obviously, I've watched the first series of Yellowstone. Yeah,
Mm.
got into that now. I'm not sure when you read it that has to be a complete fan. Well, a lot of it to me, it was Games of Thrones and mafia films put with Stetsons with cowboys in it. Yeah. Um, Elements of probably what we perceive as real ranching happening or the real sort of countryside in the US. Yeah. But very interesting. And I know it sort of caught the imagination of a lot of people outside the US as well. For better or for worse, obviously, that's not true. Yeah, I'm doing this because it's popular culture. And yeah, I mean, I did find that interesting. I'm more interested in the history of the US. I mean, when we grew up watching the cowboy films, and obviously you had the John Wayne type films, and then you had the revisionist westerns of the Clint Eastwood era or times in the 70s. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you got to keep in mind too, going back to some of Steve's questions, which is
Yeah.
there's the mainstream type pop culture,
Mm.
where as you study movies, right? There's sort of there's a handful of heroic themes and plots, and it's just a question of putting them in different
Yeah.
contexts.
Yeah.
But we also have, and I think music is a really good example where, for before my time, but, music that was national was all white.
Yeah.
And it was, it's just a certain middle of the road type music, but there was tons of other music underground.
Mm.
And there are still lots of places, whether it's jazz or sort of, there's just other types of genres that thrived, that had, small little bars that people would make their tours from Louisiana. They drive up through the country to Chicago, and there was this, a set standard group of people, but people didn't know about it until there was a few breakthroughs, like, Elvis Presley and, people who started to push, different types of music. So it's a weird country that way. It's one thing to look at the culture through the country through the eyes of the culture for stuff that's mainstream, but recognizing there's so many sort of subcurrents and subculture going on.
it's. I mean, you say Nashville. I mean, I like country music. You know, Steve and myself were talking the other day, just done a bit of a ride that it probably goes back 30 years of country music. I'm listening to Lambert and her ex-husband. I'm just trying to think who he was now. Did the voice and things like this. Yeah. Oh yeah, because obviously, I mean, country comes, or the Elvis Presley. You mentioned that it came from obviously the black gospel, the sort. Yeah, eventually that led into soul music and things like this. Yeah. Um,
When you're talking about the United States, I mean, you're talking about a vast country, and that's exactly it. It's the United States, and each state is easily the size of a country, for example, in Europe. So if you go traveling around Europe, you're going to get different cultures
yeah.
in different areas,
Mm.
right? My question more is really how times have what's changed over the years, you know? Rather than dwell on the 70s and the 80s, because we're now 2025, it was an awful long time ago. And where it's always good to get your background as to, so that we can get a better idea of how you grew up more or less and what your perception was of the United States at that time, and how the United States has changed when you were a young adult. You know, it's all naturally the questions are going to be start talking about later on in life, uh, if anything changed, because what we see now in the United States is it's very fast. Things are changing very, very fast. This last 12 years? 16 years perhaps, when Barack Obama, he was the president. Right. And by the way, here is not political. If a politician does something good, we say he's done something good. Very rare. If a politician does something bad, we'll say he did something bad. Right?
You
We
know,
don't we don't
the
hold
nice,
signs. We don't hold signs here. So
if I could just add one thing there, one of the things that I kind of mentioned, things are polarized now, but one of the things that's really tough, and Mark knows this. If there's an increasing number of people that identify as sort of independent, and it's really a reaction to ineffectiveness of government, and the more and more people have become ideological and partisan, and so it's more about what are your beliefs instead of like what are the results. And so it'd be nice to be in a time when people started to evaluate on results as opposed to just the ideas, because one of the things that I learned in business is I might have a bunch of ideas, and if I implement them and they don't work and I keep implementing them, then I'm stupid. And if I want to get results, then I will do something different, right? And so we're at a time when the change people want is to see results. And back to your question, the country, the U.S. has come together, gone apart, come together. But if you had to look at the last 16 years, as you mentioned, it has become more polarized, and there are real differences that are not easily synthesized or integrated.
do you find that people tend to sort of concentrate on just one thing? And I talk about individuals who are wanting to get into the political sphere, because I mean the political sphere, it's quite a huge umbrella, because it abords so many different aspects of life. And you get somebody that just concentrates on one particular thing, and because they concentrate on that particular thing, they ignore the rest independently what side of the aisle they're on, as you say in the US, right? Which way they lean, they sort of ignore that. And if it doesn't immediately resonate with them because they are concentrating on this one particular, a very limited scope of what they're looking at. Do you think that's why it's almost like the short-tempered, if that makes sense to you? The short-tempered of what's actually going on around them. They don't have a lot of time for it because they're concentrated on this.
Yeah, I think there's a combination of things going on there. I think you're right. There's a frustration. There is an overload of information that people are dealing with. And it's natural when you're trying to make sense of things to try to pick out things that you're going to focus on. And we do have, I don't know what the percentages are. We do have some single issue voters, and they do that. But I would say that the explosion of the podcasts going away from just 3 channels, so much information has caused that overload, and so people do tend to focus on a few things, and then if they don't get the results, then you get that frustration. So there's this sort of general frustration, but to your point, not everybody's frustrated with the same things, right? They have unique things that they want.
That's right. Now, which is why I say these people, they will focus on just one thing. Doesn't matter what it is, but it's just one thing. And because of that, they ignore the rest, sort of thing, until it's too late, so to speak.
I would agree with that.
Yeah. Again, because we looked at this and like the internet and 24-hour news, which I think came from the US, ironically, before it hit us anywhere else. Yeah.
I think what CNN was the first, right?
Yeah.
TNN or Turner, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. Turner. Yeah.
CNN.
Yeah. Yeah. CNN. Yeah. I mean, okay, it was great. You could turn on 24 hours time and see this, but yeah, it's there's got to do a lot of padding now, and I think this became apparent. And when we watch the news from the US, more so in the UK, but we say about BBC, etc., there is a definite polarization. If you vote or think a certain way, you watch Fox. If you think another way, it's MSNBC. I'm going to leave CNN out of this because CNN used to be very balanced years ago. Yeah, I mean, if you went to an airport, if you wanted to know what's happening, or even if you're at home, you put CNN on when it became available. Yeah. I think that's.
Don't forget, Michael, that when Mark was younger, he was innocent too.
I still am. Called to Steve sometimes. Yeah, I actually believe there's good in certain people in the higher levels of the hierarchy. Yeah.
You can be cynical and still believe there's a lot of good, but you're just more discerning.
You need to be convinced more, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah. You have to be very discerning, and people need to prove it a little bit.
Yeah.
So let's try and hone in on this last 8 years, right? So has there been a contrast in lifestyles in general over the last? Well, we talk about Trump's first term, and then we talk about Biden, and I want to keep out of if the election was rigged and all this. That can't come into the conversation. I'm talking about the lifestyle and what's changed, if it changed, if it's got worse, if it's got better. How would you see it without don't even need to mention names, I suppose. It's just over the last 8 years.
Well, I think the cultural dimension that has really impacted the last 8 to 12 years. I hate to use the word woke, but you have you coming out of the civil rights, you develop the DSG, DEI, and that drove additional polarization. Some of the famous Me Too, toxic masculinity, a lot of those things drove people down certain paths and antagonized and turned off other people. And so I think that's what you're seeing now. I mean, for example, young men in the U.S. now are becoming more conservative. And that's a function of, as people have pointed out, if you keep telling them they have bad instincts, they're bad people, they're going to listen to other people. And they may be listening to other people that are not trustworthy, but they know they're not bad inherently. And being painted as that has hurt. Now, you've also got, and all of this is driven, people want to be famous, they want to be rich. So they leverage all these movements, right? I mean, you could take feminism. Feminism is like eating itself in many ways, right? I mean, we have someone who's done a lot of writing in our Facebook page that's really called out the intersexual competition. It's not, anyone who thinks that feminism is a single block is missing the mark. They're competing against each other, and just as marketers are competing, with brands and trying to leverage whatever they can. Now, the interesting thing is that backlash has really pushed, woke to the background, I think. And that's why you see Donald Trump, pushing back on DEI and things like that, and getting more that his positioning as common sense resonates with a lot of people in the US. So I would say if I had to pick something, it's very hard, and I'm one person out of 330 million. I would say that some of that cultural influence over the last 12 years, and the changes as it's gone through is some of the biggest stuff that's going on in the US that's changed. And depending upon results of this administration, and it's a wait and see mode, that erosion of sort of that woke culture will continue. And if it fails, you might see a bit of a comeback with it.
There are 2 points that you mentioned that I'd like to sort of hone in on. One was this preoccupation, and this I think highlights my just looking at one aspect and ignoring the rest, which is you mentioned toxic masculinity. So surely that should just come under the umbrella of good manners, being polite. And you should be polite and have good manners with everybody. Doesn't matter if they're women or men or whatever they like to be called, right? So the problem with calling it toxic masculinity is that you drag into the fray all males, and I'm sure that not all males are the same. So what's your opinion about that one? Because it was you that brought up the what's going on in the States. They've got all these sort of little segments of people complaining about certain specific things, and when they could just draw the camera back a little bit and call it something else, which is a human behavior, I suppose, in society.
Yeah. So I think if we go back to the question, I mean, just reframing, you've asked kind of changes in, my perception of changes in the U.S. sort of over the decades, and I've kind of skipped stuff from the 80s and the 90s and gotten into the 2000s where things in the 80s and 90s, there was vast changes that were around sort of economics, free trade and kind of America, a lot of the middle of America manufacturing jobs lost as the U.S. tried to exert influence by, moving, encouraging people to move plants to Asia and stuff. And then as you get into the 2000s, you're starting to see more of this manipulated culture, war type stuff. And there are people who can speak better, more deeply on this than me, but you had the Me Too, you had this, as I mentioned, the toxic masculinity, And I think the reason that that has receded quite a bit is because it outran its usefulness for those that were using it. And secondly, most people, as you sort of mentioned, have kind of a common sense approach that says, well, not all men are like that. And, a broad brush cause people to recoil and at times to push back. So yes, I mean the fortunately that is a cultural phenomenon, just like Me Too, that is no longer. And I like to think of, every generation creates new things. The good ones will stay on, and the bad ones will be shed. And there was some good, I think, that came out of those movements, but it's pretty small compared to what really took place at the time. And as I said, because it was so strong and pushed to the forefront, that there's been a bit of a backlash, and that's why you have people who voted for Trump, who, on his promises to push back on DEI and things like that. And you've also got things like the Supreme Court case against Harvard, where they were found to be discriminating against Asians. You've got this weird, DEI is supposed to support minorities, but Jews are not considered minorities in some way by them. So there's a lot of the simple, easy messages over time get diluted because a lot of them were not right. And people are coming back to more common sense things and trying to get back to looking at people as individuals and not looking, at the importance of identity politics. And I know we're not going to do a ton of politics stuff, but you asked kind of, the last in the US, the last 8-12 years or whatever. And that political landscape, the shift is one of the most prominent things in the US, to be honest. And I take part of the last election to mean that there was you had a candidate who, was a convicted felon, who even supporters will, admit is not personally the most stand-up guy, right? And yet he got elected. And, and I think that that's part of the backlash against things that didn't work and people being frustrated with results. So
I didn't want to concentrate on the election results. I just use that because I think that when you think about the last, 8 to 12 years, and you talk about the cultural things, how life has changed. How life has changed. We all know that the elections happened, and we all know who won, and it's how your life has changed since then. If it's going to reflect on what all the stories that we receive outside the US, if you look at an MSNBC news report, it isn't news anymore. Right. It's a very one-sided attack on a certain person, which doesn't really doesn't interest me as a news report, because it isn't, well, basically because it isn't news. However, it must reflect on something in the wider world, in the US. I mean, that they put on these things about a person, and that it must reflect in the society. And also because you have these things, it must put pressure on the efficacy of who's administrating. Because if every time they do something, they get, I mean, the first, I don't want to dwell on this, but I have to say it, right? So the first thing about the Trump did for almost 4 years, he had the hoax about him being things about Russia, which we've all found out that it wasn't true. right? I'm not defending him. I'm not defending his character. I don't know the guy. But
I
that
struggle so much whenever I try to do what you're doing, which is you try to think critically on your own. You try to take in diverse sources, and if you disagree with a talking point, let's say from the left, you don't pass the purity test, and then they call you like a Trumpster, and it's like it's extremely. I struggle with this even with family members, whereas I try to think of myself as an independent thinker, and I hate defending like just one side or the other. But if one side is always sort of attacking, you end up defending, and then it makes this an appearance of like, you're a partisan, and you're not. You're just
right.
So you get this downward spiral, in this polarization, and social media is a big part of this, because all these people are getting these great dopamine highs by, I'm in this group, and like I'm sitting behind my computer so I can say mean, nasty things about other people, and it builds on itself, and it's so social media has really, been an enabler in the U.S. You have other countries that, let's say in China, where they won't let kids, get on certain things till they're a certain age, right? I mean, we are addicted to social media, and it's got its positives, but it's also got its negatives, and it's been fuel for this polarization fire.
I think as any habit that we have, it has its good points, and it gives us that pleasure, but also it's got its bad points afterwards as well, of course.
Yeah.
But put that just to because I want to come back to this, right? But the second point that I wanted to make of what you were on about before is you were on about the feminism. So when feminism started I suppose it ran about the 70s, it became very popular because the women were burning the bras. That's what they, I'm now a powerful woman. I've burnt my bras. Why should we have to wear bras? And they forget to understand that they wear their bras the same way as I would wear a vest. It's only they've got their chest is different than mine. So you wear clothes according to, but that's even feminism seems to have changed over the years. I mean, they wanted equality, and I'm all for that. If you think you can do the same things a bloke can do, get in there, do it. If you find it tough, if you find it easy, you were successful in wanting to do what you wanted to do either way. You tried it, didn't work out. You tried it, did. All men do that when they, when we follow life, as we walk through life, we'll try something. If it worked out well, great. If it worked out bad, great. We'll do something else. Like you said with your businesses, you make a decision. If it doesn't work out, you do something else. Right. But it seems that, that then the ladies started to, and somebody's going to cut me down because I call them ladies. But anyway, then the ladies started to wanted to change the vernacular of what we can say, so we can't say a manhole cover is a manhole cover anymore. It has to be a person, or a I don't know, a person cover, a person protection later or whatever, So we have, and it seems to have been evolving. Once again, it's looking at one particular point and ignoring the rest that surround you. So the same way you can see that a woman is if you say a woman's a feminist, these days, she's obviously a lesbian. Wow. But you can't.
I can't let everything go by without disagreeing. Go ahead.
No. What I'm saying is that there are people that if a woman is known as a feminist,
yeah,
she's very radical. But I'm sure there are an awful lot of feminists who consider themselves feminists who might even be stay-at-home mums. And you can't sort of as you can't class every bloke as a woman hater. You can't class every woman as a man hater, I suppose, as a feminist who thinks that they are, it's just them. And and I think that the evolution of feminism is bringing it to that.
So a couple thoughts on this, if you'll let me.
Please.
There's as many movements and organizations begin, the spark is usually something really important, right? So, for feminism, it was just continuing the progress from, voting rights and civil rights and trying to, create opportunities, for equal advancement, things like that. You could make the same comments about things with the African Americans, blacks in the U.S. Again, all started well, and then what happens is organizations exist to continue themselves, and they don't once they've accomplished their original goal, they don't go away. So they move on to the next goal, and it also serves as a foundation for people to make money and become popular. So you have, Gloria Steinem, you have
Al Sharpton.
So you get people then who piggyback on good intentions for their own organizational and personal gain.
Yeah.
And so that's an issue. And then at a certain point, and it's happened in both of those cases now, where you have competition, within sort of the feminist thinking. And I won't get this as right as some other people, but you've got the same thing going on, with people of color. And this is where the snakes start to eat themselves.
Yes.
And that they begin to compete. Now, the good news is the U.S. and I think the world, and the U.S. has led, this has come a long way in terms of creating opportunities for people to be successful, regardless of their, race, skin, sexual orientation, their gender, those kinds of things. But humans want power and they want resources and money, and it's been a way for people to get stuff. And the Mott Bailey, right? Like, it starts off with something that you can agree with, and it's a great principle, and then it becomes something else. And that's kind of what we've seen. And again, back to when these things go too far, then there's a backlash, and then they sort of quietly go away. And then there's just something new, because the people have to keep churning and getting something new to get people's attention. It's not going to get much of a dopamine high to rehash, some shavers commercial about toxic masculinity anymore, because it got so poo-pooed, right? So, but they got to find new ways, and so that's kind of what we see. It just, there's always some new way, and in the end, the good things will survive and the bad things will be shed. It's sometimes hard in the moment to know that, but over time, kind of the truth comes out, and people figure out, is this going to help me or help society in general? And the good ones move forward, and the bad stuff gets dropped.
Yeah, I mean, when we're talking about feminism and all that, we'll get away from the US, but I'll talk about here. I don't know. Yeah, Steve has sons. I have a daughter. Yeah, and I want her to go to work and be respected by the men around her and the women, obviously, and also have opportunities. Which, speaking in Brazil years ago, probably sometime after equality came into the US, it then started to come down to Brazil as well. Probably post-war, probably 1950s. I'm read the history right. I bet, like I say, I see it. I mean, yeah, again, social media has its good points, has its bad points, and it fuels the flames of all this. But remember, the original 1970s or 19 even 50s feminist movements, yeah, and again, the votes for women. That didn't actually have the internet at the time, yet it gained
No,
popularity
but,
and still got through.
but Mark,
Yeah, yeah,
the votes, the equal rights to women
yeah,
in terms of voting was a specific thing,
yeah.
and the feminist movement had a larger, uh, had a much larger umbrella. It covered an awful lot more.
Well, yeah, yeah.
But you could say that they were the seeds of the feminist movement.
That's what I'm getting at. Yeah, that's what I say. You go back, and it sort of moved forward down the 70s. I mean, as I was always brought up to, yeah, I was always told sometimes you need the pendulum to swing quite a way one way to come back, as Michael said. I'm explaining this. If you've got any students or anybody else who wants to understand what's being said. Sometimes you need to go extreme to bring it back to the center, or what is it? Yeah, there was behavior that happened in the 1940s to the 1980s, which was unacceptable with the men and masculine, you call it masculine toxicity now. But yeah, the way that people behave towards women was wrong. And again, towards blacks was wrong. Or people of different ethnicities was totally wrong. We can look at that with a lens now and look back and think, oh, probably even things in our own lifetimes, or certainly even in mine. And you're grateful for it. And yeah, when you see the civil rights movements which happened in the US and Stonewall, etc., they had a good movement. They had a good rights. And yeah, I come from an age, my generation, called Gen X or whatever you want to call it. Yeah, we got on board with all this. Yeah. At school, we were certainly not told. It's applying critical thinking. And that's a term that's come out of the US. My school in the UK, and I'm making comparisons here between the US and the UK because they're not exactly the same, despite we speak the same language, but we have totally different cultures. For example, a lot of people in the UK didn't see their first black person until the 1950s. Yeah. In the US, yeah, going back 200 years previous.
Sure.
And blacks have been part of the US society for a long time. The UK, we didn't have slaves. We may have been the biggest slave traders in the world. Yeah. But we didn't actually have slaves in the UK. There were blacks in London and different ethnicities and everything else. But yeah, so it's a different contrast. So it's always very interesting for me to see about the US and make comparisons. And then when people try and put the problems in the US, even temporary ones for today in the UK, it's a totally different society. And we've gone back to the previous part of the thing. We're talking about different states. And we have this in Brazil. When you move from the UK to Brazil, really, we're more worried about what's happening in our own state than what's happening on a federal level.
Mhm.
Yeah, because to us, probably more so in the US at the moment, our states are like our countries.
Mhm.
My wife, for example, and I'm making this as a comparison here as well. My wife is more Pernambucan, her state in the Brazil, than she is Brazilian. That's everything to her. And yeah, she's half black. My wife is effectively half black and everything else, but she doesn't get behind all
That
rights.
also makes the half white, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, okay, half black. Yeah, I know what you're saying. I guess you're going to say that, but yeah, I don't like the term. I'm going to be quite honest here. I don't like the term Afro-Brazilian. I don't like the term Afro-American. I don't like the term Black British. Because I see these terms as very divisive. I'm not saying it's easy to be in a minority or a different ethnicity than white or whatever, but I do see them as very divisive terms, and I think, as you're quite right, they've been whipped up by people who are benefiting personally from it. And as I explained to a lot of my students of different ethnicities, people are motivated by two things: power and money. Probably in that order, yeah. And it suits people at high levels on both sides, in political terms, for us to be divided as people. because without them, we don't vote for anyone. Yeah. If we all had a perfect life, we wouldn't be voting one side or another. We'd be pretty ambivalent and neutral. Yeah. And you're quite right. And for me, I'm looking as an outsider, Donald Trump. I grew up, I wouldn't say with him, knowing about him. He was in every magazine in the 80s and everything else outside the US. He was a person you read about, interesting person. Used to see interviews with him. He said some sensible things in the 70s and the 80s. Yeah. He hasn't really changed. He changed sides. And his biggest crime for me is he changed sides when he was supporting Democrat ideals and feelings. Yeah. He was the great guy. Everybody wanted him at their parties, the guy to be seen with. Suddenly he swapped sides because he didn't like the way the shift was going. And, yeah, like you're saying, the DEI and everything. And DEI for me, the same as wokeism, and I've said to Steve before, is grounded in a good place. Woke just means to awaken.
So many good intentions end up with unintended, undesirable consequences, and that's the problem.
Yeah, how do you control these? In the US, the UK, or it hasn't really filtered down that much into Brazil because we've got other problems on a daily basis other than worrying about identity.
I think it hasn't filtered down here in Brazil so much because the people just don't care about it.
That's what I mean. We've got our own issues down here. And I'll say we, you and I. Yeah.
It's if I could just jump in for a second. I mean, it's when people joke about something being a first world problem, the U.S. is very well off for the most part, right? So like we have time to sort of indulge in some of these things, and other countries that are lesser developed. And I always, I try to make sure my kids, we spent some time in Africa. We went to different places, getting another perspective. People who are struggling to get by don't have the time for some of this stuff, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And it's. Just going back to, we talked a couple things that, religious freedom is one of them, right? And I bring that up now because there's a really interesting thing going on. I don't know if in Brazil, but certainly in the UK, where you have, so many people, Muslims of the Islam faith that, Americans are looking at that and sort of like, we don't want that, right? And so think about it. I mean, that's really the number one issue Trump has been able to use, the border, and he's manipulated in a variety of different ways. But Americans don't want to be Europeans. And even while we believe in religious freedom, that one is a struggle for us. And I'd be curious, what is that like in Brazil right now? I mean, do you have that issue, or is it's not even really hit the radar screen yet?
I don't, certainly from that, but I'm a Catholic, and I've had evangelists criticize me about my faith and tell me things and have a go at me. I've had that. It doesn't bother me. Yeah, okay, freedom of expression as well. I believe, you can tell me I'm wrong in what my faith is. You be happy, you find your salvation, I find mine. The ideal society for me would be if you've got a street. Now I'll speak this Britain, and it does happen. You can have a mosque, a synagogue, an evangelist or Church of England, an Anglican church, and a Catholic church all next to each other in a street. Great, that's what we should be. And then you can be outside that, an atheist. There are some faiths, and we know where I'm talking of this. You have to have their faith, or you're outside their system, almost killed in some places. Yeah. Which is wrong as well. I have the right not to believe in anything. And having a faith is a struggle. Yeah. Every day you wake up, you question, am I right to question? Yeah. I'm not a good person, according to most faiths. Yeah. I'll lose my temper. I get angry about things and all. Yeah. But it's the UK, we have problems. The trouble is it's only, what people forget is going with its pockets of place. Yeah, like Leicester is a big Islamic place. It's been growing for years. The rights and wrongs of that's what it is. The big issue we've got, we seem to have in the UK, and not going to make bones about it. We have an administration that, again, is using that it to its advantage for power on both sides of the divide on that one. Yeah. And we call it two-tier policing, whatever else you want to call it, whether it exists, it's a perception. It may exist in, even to some police may think they're bad people, therefore they're going to go over the board and help someone of a different ethnicity because of training, because of personal beliefs, whatever. Yeah. And again, this has all been happening. The people in the political power are now beginning to get exposed with it all. There's a mini backlash happening in the UK. I've often said it's a good job we don't have a Second Amendment in the UK because we're more cynical and more cynical and more aggressive than the Americans. Would have probably played our own version of Last Man Standing by now. And I mean that about it. Yeah, we lost the right to bear arms many, many years ago. I can understand in the US why Second Amendment is very important to people because I've spoken to people there. Problems are not caused by normally people who've got license with guns, from my understanding. It's people outside the system. So you've got control of it by licensing or allowing people to have guns, concealed carry, etc. Yeah. But getting back to the core thing. Yeah, I mean, we've got, as I said, this is it. We have a lot more different social issues from the UK, from the US, UK. Certainly Brazil, like you say, Brazil, it's a struggle to survive every day. Where's my next meal coming from? Almost. Yeah, probably not Steve. I have that thing. Yeah, I've got to go to the supermarket later and cry.
Me too.
Yeah, yeah. We got almost runaway inflation down here. Yeah. Which is strange, really, because Brazil shouldn't have that at all. But that's another issue for another day. And again, I'll see us now. I know Americans because I talked to quite a few Americans outside the group that we belong to and everything else, and they're telling me, and they send me the links. This has happened in the UK. What doesn't get reported also, okay, you see the mass Islamic gatherings at Marble Arch or other places. There was a big march on St. George's Day yesterday. About 100,000 people showed up in central London waving the Union flag. Yeah. Which, yeah, okay. That shouldn't even, okay, I mean, that shouldn't be newsworthy, but the fact it isn't newsworthy speaks volumes. It wasn't on any mainstream news. Yeah, you have an Islamic march or something, it's everywhere. Yeah, hey, isn't it as good? Yeah, they're fighting for Gaza, they're fighting for this, they're fighting for that. Yeah. Okay, you can have an opinion about this. To be patriotic, I mean, we've had politicians in the winning who are now in power who said, isn't it wrong that people are carrying or displaying the Union flag or the flag of St. George? Yeah, because it's divisive. That's my flag. I'll fly it out. I'll fly my flag of St. George on the front of my house, or the side of my house, my balcony in Brazil. Yeah. Apart from the fact I have to explain to some local residents, it's not American, it's British. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Not British, it's English, sir.
It goes back to your comment about power, right? Like people want to tell you what words to use, whether it's pronouns, or tell you what words you can't use, or tell you what symbols that they're suddenly going to find offensive so that they can control the narrative.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the struggle that's going on, and it's tiring, to be honest.
Yeah. We'll ask you how many fingers are holding up, as many as you want. Yeah. Which is the old phrase. Yeah. I'm seeing all this, so I understand it. Again, this is media manipulation. There's actually a lot of good things still in the UK that exist. Yeah. But there's a lot of anger, and there's a lot of anger being deliberately whipped up. Call it indigenous population. And when I say indigenous population, I don't mean also whites. I mean people whose ancestry is not from the shores of Britain for the past, about 200 years, who are feeling it as well, feeling anger now. Yeah. People that have lived their lives in a lawful way, have entered the country lawfully. Yeah. Spent lots of money doing it, not via rubber dinghy, actually come contribute to society, whatever contribution means. Yeah. Okay. I mean, there used to be when I was growing up, there used to be an Asian family would open up a corner shop. Everyone used to criticize, but they were hardworking business people. And you go in there, and the flag of St. George, or the British flag was up. They decorated their shops at Christmas. They said they loved it. They loved the colours. It didn't mean anything to them, but they loved it. Yeah, and then what I do like sometimes is sometimes you get Indians on Darari or other places will open up to other people to come and enjoy the food, authentic Indian food and things. That's the UK, or I'd like to see. Okay, we have diversity. There's a difference between diversity and multiculturalism. Yeah, you can have your own faith, your own ideas, like in context of the country you choose to reside in. And I live as I'm a foreigner in a different country with a vastly different culture from that my own. Yeah, only in Brazil I can take and leave what I like and dislike. Yeah, I don't have to like every bit of music in Brazil, or I don't have to like everything that happens. So I disagree with my wife on things, but I have to go along with it because it's the local culture. Yeah. And this is what you have to learn when you live in another culture that's not yours. Tolerance. And this is what I see in the US. I've seen interviews, but we know in the US, if there's a black person, whatever religion or anything, who might support a certain candidate, they're called all sorts of names. Yeah, I've seen that there. And by people in authority as well. And when people in authority are calling for other prominent figures to be disposed of, being very careful with my wording on YouTube, that's wrong as well. And then nothing gets lifted against them. If I was to say it here now, oh, this person should be disposed of, yeah, so I could have all sorts of things. A policeman locking on my door in the UK, potentially my family's door. But and this is what's gone wrong. And it's all these monitoring of social media. You can beat someone up in the street and nothing happens to you. You post the wrong thing wrong on Facebook in the UK, and you have 7 policemen at your front door. Yeah,
It's incredible.
I've got a couple of questions, right? And they're easy ones this time. Did eggs really go up to $20 a tray of 30? And have they really come back down in price?
So
But basically, the
I don't
broader
buy
question.
eggs by the 30, but your question is, I mean, in fact, I actually happened to look at this recently. Eggs spiked in the beginning of March and have come down dramatically, actually, since it's a function of they think relaxed a few regulations, and so there's some more import of eggs from other countries, and there's been less killing of chickens, in terms of like some bird flu stuff. So yes, the two areas that eggs prices have come down and oil prices have come down. Now, oil, all these things are tricky, and like it's always very it's messy to ascribe reasons for these things being political, because a lot of economic stuff it is outside of politics. So yes, the inflation has come down, and some of those areas that you just mentioned, it's the issue is that I talk about partisans. I mean, there's someone on Facebook who's a big partisan, has a page talking about the high price of eggs and use data from March, knowing that the prices now are like almost half, right? But they got to get the last sort of like point in, right, about how prices are high, because you got people who just keep going around saying, yeah, prices are high, because you just keep repeating the same misinformation. People end up just saying, well, it must be true because I heard it, 25 times.
I wasn't asking you specifically about eggs. I was on about the comfort level of your life. over the last 8 years? Has it got any better? Has it got any worse? And also, the final question, of course, would be the future. What do you see that is going to happen in the future, as in America, as an American?
So you had asked the question in terms of prices, and I know you'd mentioned earlier about high inflation in Brazil. But you used the word comfortable, and I kind of want to address that because by any objective measures, like the US, Western society, all that has become more comfortable. I mean, living longer, we've got more goods, we've got all those things. However, going back to some of the things we talked about in the beginning, there's a lot of turbulence, and the turbulence is caused by a gap in sort of what people are expecting versus what they have. And I will say that I think the propagandists are taking advantage of two truths. One is people are self-oriented, self-interest, which is a good thing. We have agency. And the other is there's variation in nature. And we're all born with different talents. We're born into different levels of poverty or wealth. We have different levels of work ethic. And so you'll always be able to point to people and say, why should he have or she have this and you don't have it? So there's a lot of turbulence on the expectations. There's a lot of turbulence, from the social issues with like the deportations in the US. So from a general high level standpoint, are we more comfortable? Yes. If you look at quote unquote the economy, yes, but the economy breaks down into different subsegments, and some groups are more happy than others, and that's kind of natural. But that gap to expectations has really been playing out, and it's there was a lot of protests in the U.S. about 3-4 weeks ago. They're calling, some groups are calling for like a general strike. I do think that we're headed towards some kind of protests, potentially riots, maybe going back to sort of the Black Lives Matter type situation. And I'm not trying to criticize that movement, but I'm just saying of that caliber where they start as protests and become increasingly, more riots, the vandalism on the Teslas. So
that's not so much the Black Lives Matter, although the Black Lives Matter did become dirty because of the directors of the Black Lives Matter start to buy and sell houses and things like that. But
that was back to the example of movements start with good intentions and something right, and organizations and people tend to
but the thing is, yeah, Black Lives Matter arrived at the same time as Antifa, and I suppose for a certain extent the two walked hand in hand for a while because they were very much intermingled. And whereas Black Lives Matter now, I suppose, is taking is in the background more. You don't hear too much about it. But
like Me Too, it's like toxic masculinity. They had their day. On the other side, you had the Tea Party, and you had so you're always going to have groups that will appeal to the fringe right, the fringe left. I mean, if you want to look at it that way.
What seems to have prevailed is Antifa.
Yeah. So I do think that, I'm optimistic. I do think that we're in for some real short-term turbulence. And I don't know how it resolves itself. I think that I would not be surprised if we had civil disobedience, vandalism, riots that far outstripped what people would say happened on January 6th. In social media, I'm seeing the language ramped up. It's the protest a couple weeks ago that was like hands off, but now it's like stand firm. It's we won't take it. I mean, there's definitely a change in tone. Now, going back to what we said before about comfort levels, people who generally want to go to civil war have they've lost something. They have a real reason, right? We have a lot of people that even if they're not meeting their expectations, they're doing pretty well, right? They're putting food on the table. They have their smartphone. So I don't know whether these people are going to be able to be manipulated into something of a large scale. I think we'll see stuff on a small scale, but whether it becomes large scale or not, I don't know. There's a huge dissatisfaction amongst a lot of people. So I'm optimistic longer term, but I think in the short term, I see a lot of turbulence potentially in the U.S.
But after the turbulence, do you think it'll go up or do you think it'll go down?
I think it'll go up. I do think it'll go up. I do think that so many things outside of politics, technology. I mean, for the U.S., for example, huge boom to the country was the development, of fracking technologies, right? I mean, energy is so critical to life and to progress as a society, right? And all of that incredible fracking technology, has put the U.S. into be the number one exporter of natural gas, right? So huge wins in technology, artificial intelligence driven a lot coming out of the U.S., right? That's going to make additional progress possible, better quality of life, potentially as it's used by doctors and people in a variety of fields. So I'm optimistic because I think the innovation, the U.S. has generally been a powerful, innovative force, for the U.S. and for the world. And I think technology will continue to push us that way or pull us that way, whatever the right phrase is. But we've got some short-term turbulence for sure. But longer term, I believe those technological advancements continue to pull us through, just as they have in the past.
So you're saying basically that the US is going to have its watershed moment, but after this short spat, if you like, it's going to work itself out.
I think so. I think that
of course, for the better.
For the better, but I also think that there's the chance for some other crazy things that people wouldn't expect. I mean, so for example, if the combination of artificial intelligence and automation propels the U.S. to greater heights in terms of domestic productions, but generates a lot of unemployment. I mean, I think you could see the U.S. tilt a little more towards Europe in terms of like social, safety nets, a universal basic income type thing, which would have been unheard of in the country 10 years ago. I think those things start to get on the table potentially again as expectations. There's a gap between expectations and reality for certain groups of people. Then those things could end up becoming. The U.S. could see doing things like that. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, there are conservatives who would argue for UBI, and it's not always been sort of a liberal thing. So all the technology progress is a positive, but there may be things that the government has to do to address the dislocations.
Okay, time to wrap this one up. Look, Michael, thanks very, very much for joining us on this podcast. Very important to hear an American's point of view about what's happening in the United States. because of course we on the outside, we're going to get a filtered view of what's actually going on, and it's really, really interesting to get a personal internal view, and for it to be transmitted in such an eloquent way, if I may say so. So thanks very, very much for taking part in our podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. And I encourage, if you're people who watch your podcast are interested in others, that you guys will continue to bring in some other Yanks. And as Mark knows, there are some Yanks that live in Europe and live in other parts of the world, and they might even be able to do a better job doing those comparisons than I could.
Not impossible, because you're speaking from your boots are on the ground.
Yeah.
And that's what I need to get it from the source.
Good. Well, just remember, it's my sneakers now, because those boots were a little uncomfortable.
Sure, sure. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. Thank you.
All right, guys.